It's funny how the years you think will be forgettable end up carving the deepest grooves into your memory. If you'd asked me back then, I would have told you my life was fine, ordinary, predictable in the best way. I had my morning routine down to muscle memory: shave, shower, tie the same knot in the same old navy tie, and head out the door just as the neighbor's sprinklers kicked on. I'd get to the office 15 minutes early, not because I had to, but because I liked the quiet before the chaos. The hallways smelled faintly of copier toner and that burnt coffee aroma from the break room, the kind only a 30-year-old coffee maker can produce. I'd pour myself a cup anyway, stirring in powdered creamer like I'd done every day for decades, and lean against the counter while I waited for the first few coworkers to drift in. We'd exchange those half-sincere greetings. Morning. How was the weekend? Nothing deep but comforting in their repetition. After 30-plus years, these people were more than coworkers. They were the background music to my life. We'd been through everything together: mergers, sessions, promotions. That one time the server crash had everyone in the office on edge for a week. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. There's a quiet pride that comes with giving decades to the same place. You start to believe you're part of the foundation, like the building couldn't stand without you. I wore that like a badge of honor, and maybe, deep down, I liked the fact that I didn't have to wonder who I was. I was this job, this desk. I wasn't the kind of guy chasing big dreams or changing careers every few years. My world was right there in those beige walls and fluorescent lights. Looking back, I can see it now. The little hints that I'd tied too much of myself to that place, like the way my mood for the day depended on a single email from my boss, or how I never made plans that would require leaving work early, even when I could have, or how the first thing I'd tell a stranger when they asked about me wasn't my hobbies or my family, but what I did for a living. If I'd been paying attention, maybe I would have noticed the cracks forming. But that year, I thought the ground under my feet was rock solid, and in a way, that false sense of security was the most dangerous thing of all. It started like any other Tuesday emails. Coffee, the sound of someone laughing too loudly a few cubicles over. I was halfway through drafting a report when my desk phone rang. Not my cell, my desk phone. Nobody uses the desk phone anymore, not unless it's something official. Hey, could you pop into conference room B? It was Lisa from HR. Her voice was flat, polite, but too polite. I glanced at my calendar. Nothing scheduled. What's this about? I asked. She didn't answer, just said your boss will be there. Now here's the thing. After decades in an office, you get a sixth sense for the weight behind words. And in that moment, I felt it. That strange, heavy pressure in my chest. Still, I grabbed my notebook, the same one I always brought to meetings. Like this was going to be just another item to cross off my to-do list. The hallway to conference. Room B felt longer than usual. It's strange how the mind starts noticing things it normally filters out. The faint hum of the vending machine, the squeak of my shoes against the carpet. When I pushed the glass door open, they were already sitting there, Lisa from HR. And Mark, my boss. Mark smiled, but it wasn't his normal smile. It was tight. Practiced on the table in front of him was a manila folder with my name on. I sat down. My hands were suddenly too big for my lap, and then came the phrase. Dropped like a stone into the room. Workforce optimization. That's what they called it. Not firing, not laying off. Workforce optimization, as if I were some outdated piece of software they'd decided to uninstall. They talked about shifting resources and aligning with strategic priorities. Mark kept his eyes on the table while Lisa slid a packet of papers toward me. Severance details, benefits expiration dates, instructions for turning in my badge. Their voices were calm, rehearsed like they'd said this same thing to 10 other people that morning. I don't even remember what I said. I think I nodded a lot. Maybe cracked a bad joke. Something about guess I'll finally have time to fix that leaky faucet. That's what you do when your whole world tilts. Sideways, you grab for something that feels normal, but nothing about that moment was normal. Not the way Lisa avoided my eyes. Not the way Mark's pen kept tapping against the table. Not the way my own heartbeat drowned out half their sentences. When it was over, I walked out carrying a white envelope that felt heavier than it should have. The office looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Phones ringing, people typing, someone microwaving lunch. But I knew I wasn't part of it anymore. And the strangest part? Nobody even looked up. I don't remember leaving the parking lot. 1 second, I was walking toward my car. The next, I was already halfway down the road. My fingers locked so tightly on the steering wheel that my knuckles looked pale. It was mid-afternoon. The kind of time when the streets are quiet, when the world feels paused between lunch breaks and school pickups. The sunlight had that sharp, almost metallic glare that makes you squint, but I barely noticed. I must have driven those same streets 1,000 times before, but they felt wrong. Like someone had picked up my whole neighborhood, shaken it, and put it back slightly out of alignment. The gas station on the corner, the old bakery with the crooked sign. They were still there, but it felt like I was seeing them from behind glass. My mind kept rewinding to that moment in the conference room, the manila folder. The word optimization, the way Mark avoided my eyes. Like if he looked at me too long, he might actually see the person he was discarding. And then there was this strange mix of thoughts running on 2 separate tracks. One was practical. Okay, so I have severance for a while. Health insurance runs out in 3 months. What's next? The other was pure disbelief after 30 years. Just like that, somewhere between those 2 tracks, a third one whispered, "Who am I now?" I passed the diner where I used to grab breakfast on early shift days. A flashback hit, sitting in that corner booth 20 years ago. Younger, hungrier, thinking the only direction my career could go was up. If I'd told that version of me how it would end, he'd have laughed. Or maybe he'd have gone back to eating his eggs and toast, thinking I was crazy. I caught my reflection in the rear view, its mirror at a red light. I didn't recognize the guy looking back. His eyes were a little too wide, his jaw tight. There was a faint tremor in his lips, like he was holding something back. Anger, tears, maybe both. The light turned green. I didn't move. A car behind me honked and I jerked forward, muttering an apology to no one. The rest of the drive was a blur. The sound of my turn signal, clicking, felt louder than it should. Every bump in the road seemed sharper. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had dipped just enough to throw the front of the house into shadow. I sat there for a minute, engine running, staring at my own front door. It was the same door I'd walk through every day after work. But that day it felt like stepping through it would mean admitting something final, like once I crossed that threshold, there was no going back to the man I was that morning. I turned off the engine. The house was waiting. I wasn't ready. The first thing I noticed after the firing wasn't the lack of income. It was the quiet, not the peaceful kind. Not the sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, quiet. No, this was the kind of silence that presses against your skin. The kind where the refrigerator suddenly sounds like it's mocking you. The first few mornings, my body still woke up at the same time it always had. 6:15 sharp. For 30 years. That alarm had been the starter pistol for my day. Shave, tie, keys, door. Now the alarm still went off. But I didn't have anywhere to run to. I'd make coffee and sit at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular outside. The world moved on without me. The neighbor reversing out of his driveway, the garbage truck clanking down the street. It's strange how you can feel invisible in your own life. Friends reached out at first. A couple of sorry to hear texts. A let's grab lunch from a coworker who promised to keep me in the loop. But as the days blurred into each other, those messages slowed. And when people did check in, I could hear the careful tone in their voices, like I was a fragile vase they didn't want to knock over. I tried to fill the hours, fix that leaky faucet, cleaned the garage, organized the junk drawer, but none of it filled the gap. There's a certain rhythm you get used to after decades of work, the constant hum of deadlines, emails, people needing you. When that stops, the quiet isn't just around you. It's inside you. I'd catch myself staring at my work bag in the corner. It still had my last half-finished notepad in it, my company pen, my badge. I didn't throw them away. Couldn't have felt like tossing them would mean tossing away a part of myself. And then there was the anger. It crept in at odd times, folding laundry, rinsing dishes. Not the loud, shouting kind of anger, but the kind that simmers, the kind that makes you clench your jaw without realizing it. I'd hear that phrase again, workforce optimization, and feel my teeth grind. One afternoon, about 2 weeks in, I sat in the living room with the blinds half closed. The TV was on, but muted. That's when it hit me. I had no idea what day it was. No meetings to prep for. No deadlines to track. No reason to mark time. And that scared me more than losing the paycheck, because the truth is, I wasn't. Just unemployed. I was. Unmoored. It was a Thursday. Not that days meant much anymore. But I remember because the trash bins were still sitting out from the morning pickup. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through job listings I wasn't even sure I wanted. When my phone rang, the name on the screen made me pause. Eddie. We'd worked together for years. Same department. Different roles. The kind of guy you share bad coffee and quick jokes with during long days. Since the layoff, we hadn't spoken. I picked up. Hey man, I said, trying to sound like I hadn't been talking to almost no one for the past 2 weeks. But Eddie's. The voice wasn't casual. It had that low, tight edge people get when they're about to tell you something they probably shouldn't. Listen, he started. I don't know if I should even be saying this, but you need to know something. Leaned back in my chair, already feeling my pulse pick up. What are you talking about? There was a pause on his end, long enough for me to hear the faint hum of whatever office space he was in. Then he said, They didn't fire you because of optimization. That was cover. I felt my grip on the phone tighten. What do you mean? Another pause. I can't say much, but do you remember those budget meetings last quarter? Ones that didn't make sense? I did. I remembered sitting in that stuffy conference room while vague slides full of meaningless jargon flashed on the screen. I remembered asking questions that got brushed off. Eddie's voice dropped even lower. There's stuff going on, money moving around, reports being rewritten. I think they were worried you were starting to connect the dots. You were in too. Many of the wrong meetings. I laughed, but it wasn't from humor. It was the kind of laugh you let out when something clicks and you hate that it makes sense. He hesitated and added, Be careful who you talk to. Just trust me on that. We said our goodbyes, though goodbye felt too final. I hung up and just sat there, the phone still in my hand. My coffee gone cold in front of me. That quiet, heavy fog I'd been stuck in for weeks. The one. Made of sadness and disbelief started to thin, and underneath it was something. Sharper. Curiosity. Suspicion. And if I'm being honest, a flicker of something I hadn't felt since that conference room purpose, because maybe this wasn't the end of my story with them. The fog of those first 3 weeks had lifted, but what replaced it was heavier, determined, uneasy, hungry for answers. I started small. Old emails, files I'd downloaded for reports, budgets from last quarter, at first. It felt harmless, just a curious glance, a way to keep my mind occupied. But then the pattern emerged. Numbers that didn't add up, invoices that had been adjusted. With vague notes, approvals signed by people who, I realized, had no authority to sign them. I remember sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, laptop open, lights dim, coffee gone cold for the 3rd time that day, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the faint smell of rain from the window slightly ajar. All of it felt amplified. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I pieced together bits of evidence that didn't belong, and then the flashbacks hit. The meetings where Mark had given that rehearsed smile and nodded while someone else explained a minor discrepancy. It's a casual joke about keeping things off the books that I'd laughed at because it sounded absurd at the time. The offhand comment in the break room. Some things are just how they have to be. All those little moments suddenly weren't little. They were breadcrumbs. Leading to something bigger, I started printing things out, organizing folders, highlighting suspicious lines in red and yellow. I was careful, methodical. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about understanding. About clarity, nights were the worst. The house was dark except for the harsh glow of the laptop screen, the cursor blinking back at me like a heartbeat. Every time I uncovered something new, I felt a mix of dread and adrenaline. Dread because I realized how deep this went. Adrenaline because finally there was a path forward. I remember one night, staring at a spreadsheet so long my eyes burned, thinking, I trusted this place. I trusted them. And for what? But the anger wasn't blind anymore. It was focused, sharp, clear, and with it came a strange, quiet satisfaction. The knowledge that I was finally seeing the truth. It was in those shadows, the empty files, the muted office chatter, the erased logs that the reality settled in. This wasn't about workforce optimization. This was about covering their mistakes. And me? I was collateral. It wasn't a loud moment. No shouting, no door slamming. It was quiet. So quiet that when it hit me, I almost didn't believe it. I'd been piecing together files for days, budget discrepancies, altered invoices, emails that never should have been deleted. Every new piece fit like a puzzle, revealing a picture that was both familiar and horrifying. And then, there it was, the irrefutable proof. A single document buried in a folder that hadn't been touched in months, one name, one signature, one date. It connected everything, and my stomach sank like a stone. I remember sitting back in my chair staring at the screen and letting out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I wasn't fired for redundancy. I whispered to the empty room. I was fired because I saw too much. The anger came next, sharp, cold, and fast. It wasn't the why me kind of anger, it was the how dare you kind of anger. All the months of polite nods, all the years of loyalty, the quiet mornings and tedious reports, meaningless to them. They'd treated me like I was disposable, and yet there was clarity now, a kind of clarity that slices through the fog of disbelief, confusion, and grief. I knew exactly what had happened. I knew exactly who had orchestrated it, and I knew what I could do about it. I remember standing, pacing the room, papers clutched in my hands. The rain had picked up outside, hammering against the windows. A fitting soundtrack for the storm inside me. I thought of Mark's rehearsed smile, Lisa's polite avoidance of my eyes, the hollow phrase workforce optimization. Every single moment was suddenly crystal clear, but there was something else. Underneath it all, a flicker of relief, because for the first time in weeks, I wasn't confused. I wasn't wandering through silence or sitting idle at a kitchen table. I had direction, and even in the heat of that anger, I could feel the beginnings of something else. Resolve. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not quietly. Not while I could still act. I took a deep breath, sank into the chair, and stared at the evidence one more time. The breaking point wasn't just about discovering the truth. It was about claiming it, owning it, deciding what to do with it. The first step was silence. Not the paralyzing silence of the weeks after my firing, but a deliberate, careful silence. I couldn't rush. I couldn't make noise. One wrong word to the wrong person in all of this. Everything I'd uncovered could vanish like smoke. I started making calls, discreet ones. 2 people who mattered. Some names I whispered to myself as I typed them. Into the phone. Journalists who weren't afraid of exposing corruption. Regulatory agencies who could follow the paper trail. Every conversation was measured careful. I didn't reveal everything, just enough to plant the seed. There were nights I stayed up until the early hours, scanning documents, composing emails, making copies. The house was dark, except for the harsh glow of the laptop screen. Outside, the city slept, oblivious to the storm brewing in my little corner of the world. I remember a flash of fear one night. What if they found out what I was doing? What if they tried to turn it back on me? But the fear was quickly replaced by a strange exhilaration. The first time in weeks, I felt powerful. I also remembered the little rituals I created to keep myself grounded, coffee in a thermos by my side, sticky notes lining the edges of the laptop screen, reminders to breathe, to think, to be patient. The ticking of the old wall clock, each tick a metronome for the careful strategy I was constructing. Every email sent, every call made, every folder sorted was a piece of the puzzle coming together. The same office that had tossed me aside like I was nothing was about to be confronted with the truth it uncovered. And I wasn't doing it with anger alone. I was doing it with precision, with justice, with the slow-burning satisfaction of someone who had been underestimated for decades. There were moments of doubt. Of course, I'd sit back, head in my hands, thinking, maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe this isn't worth it. But then I'd remember that conference room, the manila folder, the phrase workforce optimization. I'd remember how they'd tried to erase me, and every doubt would vanish like fog in the morning sun. I wasn't. The same man they had fired 3 weeks ago. I wasn't lost anymore. I was focused. I was strategic, and I was ready. It started quietly. It's like a ripple across still water. One email sent to the right person. One phone call followed up, and then the world I had been forced out of began to crack. The news hit the office first. Whispers. In hallways, tense glances, half-hearted jokes, all under the surface. A current of panic. People who had ignored me for 3 weeks now looked around nervously, unsure what to say, unsure who to trust, and Mark's carefully rehearsed smiles vanished. His emails, once sharp and commanding, came with awkward phrasing. I caught snippets from colleagues. He'd been called in for meetings he hadn't scheduled. HR had questions. The same polite detachment he'd wielded against me was being turned inward. I didn't celebrate. Not really, because the truth is, watching a system unravel is complicated. It's not just joy, it's relief mixed with sorrow, vindication laced with unease. Some of the people I cared about in that office were caught in the crossfire. They hadn't done anything wrong, yet they were swept up in the chaos. I spent hours watching from the sidelines, careful not to insert myself too publicly. There was a strange, quiet satisfaction in knowing that the truth was finally surfacing. The same company that had called me redundant was now scrambling to contain the damage. Every casual phrase I'd heard in the past, optimization, realignment, minor discrepancies, now rang hollow. Exposed as lies, friends and former coworkers reached out. Some were shocked, some were grateful, and a few couldn't hide the resentment they felt toward leadership. I tried to respond with measured words, but inside, I was still processing everything. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even really triumph. It was the slow, unfolding weight of justice finally being acknowledged. And then there were the quiet moments, the ones where I'd sit back in my living room, coffee in hand, and let the reality sink in. I had been fired at 55, told I was no longer needed, and yet, here I was. The world hadn't ended. I hadn't broken, in fact. I was seeing it all more clearly than ever. The fallout wasn't just about them. It was about me. 2, about realizing that the life I had built inside those walls wasn't the only life I could have. The world beyond the office, vast, unpredictable, messy, suddenly seemed full of possibility. 3 weeks after that fateful meeting, 3 weeks after the silence and the disbelief, I woke up and realized something had shifted. Not in the world outside that was still spinning, different as ever, but inside me. I had spent so long defining myself by a job, by a desk, by the predictable rhythm of office life. And now, I wasn't defined by it anymore. I had been stripped down. Yes, but in that stripping, I'd found clarity. The house smelled like fresh coffee that morning. I didn't rush. I made my cup slowly, savoring the warmth against my hands, the steam. Curling into the soft morning light, I stepped outside onto the porch, the air crisp, carrying the faint smell of wet grass from last night's rain. For the first time in weeks, I felt present, fully awake rather than a ghost drifting through someone else's story. I thought about everything that had happened, the firing, the deception, the evidence, the fallout, the rage I'd felt. the heartbreak, the quiet despair. All of it had led me here, and here was something else. A small, steady sense of freedom. I wasn't celebrating, not really. The people I had trusted, the company I had given decades to, had tried to erase me. But I had learned something they could never take away. My awareness, my clarity, my voice. I realized that the phrase workforce optimization didn't matter anymore. The loss I had feared wasn't a loss at all. It was a redirection. I walked down the street, coffee in hand, the city still waking up around me. Neighbors waved, joggers passed, the distant hum of traffic filled the air. Everything was ordinary, mundane. But it felt new, alive. The air felt sharper. Colors looked brighter. Sounds carried more weight. I was seeing it all through eyes that had been reopened, and in that moment, I made a quiet promise to myself to never again tie my sense of self to a single place, a single role, single identity, to remain aware, vigilant, and open to life beyond the walls I had spent decades walking within. To value my worth, not by someone else's judgment, but by the truths I held within me. I took a sip of coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me, and smiled, not at the past, not even fully at the future, but at the moment itself. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had returned to me. The world was still spinning, still unpredictable, still messy, but for the first time in decades I wasn't afraid. Had stepped through the storm, and now I could walk forward. Asterisk.